All right. Well, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. Are we live?
Yeah, we're live. Oh yeah, don't say anything.
Hey,
Yeah.
how's it going?
Pretty good.
Cool. All right.
All right. I guess just for my audience, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and all that jazz?
I'm Amos Yee. I'm the guy who has been stirring shit up within the skeptic community by supporting pedophilia, trying to eliminate age of consent laws for sex, legalizing child pornography, and ending discrimination for pedophiles, people who are sexually attracted to children. So yeah.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I like philosophical debates, and it seems like a lot of people have a lot of difficulty discussing things that make them uncomfortable. And what could be more uncomfortable to discuss than pedophilia? So, sounds like a fun conversation. So I guess if there's anything, if there's nothing else you want to get out of the way, we could just hop right into it.
I just want to say, without a doubt, you don't think I'm a troll, right?
I'm not too sure. I mean, I've looked at a little bit of your stuff. It's really hard for me to say, but I don't really care if you're trolling or not. I think it's an interesting idea to engage with regardless, and a lot of people seem ill-equipped to do it, so...
Yeah, that's wonderful. Because, all the big YouTubers, like Andy Worski, Logic, Jeff Holiday, Sargon of Akkad, they've all been falsely claiming that I'm a troll, which I'm not. I'm perfectly genuine with my opinions. And I think that that's just a way to weasel out of a discussion about this, since I think they're kind of incompetent in dealing with it.
Yeah, sure, that's entirely possible. And that's I would assume that when it comes to people like Sargon or Andy, so yeah, that's not... Yeah.
Yeah.
But like I said, to go back to the beginning, I really, whether or not you're trolling, I don't really care. I'm more interested in the discussion. So, okay.
Sweet.
So before we start, I just want to define something so that we're kind of on the same page here and everything. Okay. So firstly, just so that we're on the same page, I'll make the distinction between, I know there's different things, it's like pedophilia and hebephilia or something. For the purposes of this conversation, I think we're just going to refer to all underage sexual relationships with older people as pedophilia, understanding that a 15 or 16-year-old, or attraction to a 15 or 16-year-old isn't necessarily a pedophile, like medically speaking, right? We'll just stick with the legal definition. Is that okay, or...?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then I understand the distinction that pedophilia is scientific, or medically speaking, is an attraction to a prepubescent person. So somebody attracted to a 14, 15, 16-year-old isn't scientifically or medically like a pedophile, but we'll just stick with that definition for consistency's sake for the argument, right?
Cool.
Okay.
So basically like a sexual attraction to anybody below the age of 18?
Yeah, we'll say age of majority in the United States is 18, sure. We'll just use that, although that is kind of arbitrary. Because, moving on to the next point, just so I understand your position, you're arguing that all age of consent laws should be abolished, that a 2 or 3-year-old could sufficiently engage in sexual activity with somebody that's 20, 30, 40 years old, right?
Yes, absolutely. I would say sexual penetration, perhaps not until the age of 7 or something, but sexual acts, definitely.
Okay, gotcha. All right, just so that we're on the same page. Okay, so for my moral system, and I think that most people would agree with this, acts are generally considered as morally neutral unless you're given an argument for why something shouldn't be done. So, in the realm of pedophilia, for instance, this is something that you would regard as a morally neutral act, unless you give a reason why it shouldn't be done, because that's typically how we approach, making value statements about things. So I believe that the onus would be on me to present a reason why I believe that pedophilia is an immoral action, rather than pedophilia is the default, and then you have to provide a reason, or it's default bad, and you have to provide a reason why it's good. So then I'll be giving an argument for why I believe it's immoral, and then I'm kind of curious to hear your response to that.
Sweet. Oh, I'd just like to confirm, are we live? Because I don't see the video on YouTube that's live.
Oh, shit, I'm sorry. I'm actually, YouTube is just a little thing I do on the side. I'm actually a Twitch streamer. If you go to this website, this is where I'm at right now. Or this is my website. I type both of you on Discord. You see it?
Yeah. Okay, so basically, I can, after the stream, if I want to mirror the debate on my channel, I'll just, download it from there?
Yeah, if you want to. Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. But we're definitely live right now.
Yep. Yeah, we are. Well, yeah,
cool.
If you go to that Twitch site, you'll be able to see me, right?
That works. All right, let's dance.
Okay.
Okay. So why I think pedophilia is all right? Well, yeah, basically, there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a sexual attraction to children. and pure sexual acts with the children, like, making out with them, casual touching of genitals, I think it's perfectly fine. And the fact is that there's definitely discrimination involved in terms of saying that act is completely very harmful. And I think if it's perfectly consensual and it's not abuse or manipulative in that kind of relationship, then it should not be considered harmful. And so if we just strip away the human rights of adults to have sexual interaction with children, then that's stripping away their human rights, taking away somebody's rights to enjoy something that's completely harmless. That is, the epitome of discrimination and authoritarianism.
Sure. So, okay, so I have two syllogisms that I kind of want to run through to get to the conclusion where pedophilia is immoral, and I just want to talk through these, and you can tell me what you agree or disagree with. So I'm going to do my first syllogism has three premises, and then a conclusion, and then the second one we'll move on to that. So the first thing that I want to talk about is whether or not children are capable of giving informed consent, and this may or may not be where we disagree with the most. So, yeah. So Holiday kind of touched on this, but I think he was missing a little bit out of this. But this will be probably what most of our discussion is centered on. So,
yeah.
So my first thing I would say is that informed consent means that both sides are able to weigh the short-term and long-term ramifications of an action. Do you think that's an okay definition for informed consent?
Sure.
Okay. I would say that as it exists, so it's important to recognize the distinction between how we would wish society would act and how society exists today. So I would say that as it exists in society today, sexual activity carries long-term ramifications. Would you agree or disagree with that?
You're saying that every action contains long-term ramifications?
Well, specifically, I would say that sexual activity today carries long-term ramifications.
Oh, yeah, sure. You could say that for every activity. Or action.
Well, not necessarily. For instance, a child playing with a set of Lego blocks probably won't carry long-term ramifications. Playing a few keys on a piano probably won't. Getting a life-altering surgery, like female genital mutilation or male genital mutilation or something like that, right, would be long-term ramifications. So I draw a distinction.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So,
that's what you're referring to. Okay, sure. I get you.
Sure. So with sexual activity, especially in regards to sexual activity, there are social stigmas that are carried along with sexual activity, along with possible mental or personal trauma that could or could not occur with sexual activity, right? I'm not saying it happens every single time, but that it could happen, right?
Of course.
Okay.
But I think I should stop you right there because I think you're just defining. I'm assuming what you're trying to imply is that basically if you want a child to consent to sex, he has to be completely informed in his decision to consent to sex.
Yeah, a little bit.
I think that your argument is completely...
Well, real quick, I mean, if we agree on these two, this would be my next part of my premise then, is that would be children are incapable of weighing the long-term ramifications of sexual activity. And then do you disagree or agree with that?
The long-term ramifications of sexual activity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there... some of them might not be, but some of them could have.
Do you think that there exists? Do you think
how
that?
Old he is, really.
Sure, but do you think there exists a 4-year-old child that is capable of weighing the long-term emotional or mental ramifications of sexual activity on this planet? A 4 or 5-year-old?
Very unlikely. I'll give you that.
Sure.
But yeah, and I think that the argument completely falls apart for you because I think that you think that you need to be completely informed of an action before you're able to consent to it, and I'm going to make the argument that no, you do not have to be completely informed of an action, to be able to consent to it.
Okay.
Take, for instance,
Well, here, wait, do you want to wait for like 2 seconds because that's actually my next syllogism, and then we can hop right into that.
Sure.
So the conclusion on my first syllogism then is that children are incapable of giving informed consent, and it sounds like we both agree on that. We're not at a moral condemnation of pedophilia yet. We just agree that children aren't really capable of giving informed consent to sexual activity, right?
I'm not going to make the broad generalization that all children can't give consent, especially informed consent, especially since we're already referring to children as people below the 18. Post-pubescent children, definitely. And younger children, less likely, but yeah, I'm not going to give the broad generalization that all of them can't consent
Do you think it would be fair? We can
informed consent.
Sure, we can narrow this a little bit to make it less ambiguous. What if we narrowed this part of the argument to just children under the age of 13? So, like an 11 or 12-year-old wouldn't be able to give informed consent to having sexual activity with a 30-year-old?
Maybe under the age of I don't know, 4. I'll give it to you.
So you think that a 5 or a 5 or a 6-year-old person would be able to would have a well understanding. Or would have a good understanding of the long-term ramifications of sexual activity with a 30 or 40-year-old?
The long-term, yeah.
So basically, I'm talking like possible, like I'm talking like some type of mental ramification or emotional ramification. So, for instance, a child engages in sexual activity at the age of 5, and then later, when they're 13 or 14, they start to have regrets about it, or they wish they hadn't done that. Do you think that?
Yeah, but that's basically a possibility for any kind of action, really. So
kind of, but if it's an action where you didn't really have the like, for instance, we wouldn't expect a 5 or 6-year-old person to understand when they were 15 or 16 how that sexual, this is kind of goes back into the informed consent thing. We wouldn't expect them to understand like what the ramifications of that action were, versus like comparing it to like a 22-year-old buying a car and then regretting it 3 years later. Well, it was within their faculty to do all of the necessary research to know if they wanted to keep the car or not. Whereas a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old, we wouldn't really expect them to have developed the mental faculty yet to understand whether or not that sexual activity they were engaging with would be condemned by society or not, or would make them otherwise feel uncomfortable, as they approach their pubescent years.
That really depends on like the sexual activity, because I'm assuming that I think you're under the broad generalization that every sexual activity is like, it has a huge impact on the child, and it will have really long-term emotional consequences. I doubt that. I would consider like bathing a sexual activity. I would consider like, a kid happily touching adult's dick after after the parent gives him candy as a sexual activity. And those are completely harmless, and I don't think it has the huge emotional ramifications that you are implying that sexual activities would have. So
moving on to so we can revisit the second premise, because now it seems that you disagree with this one, which is fine. So the second premise was, as it exists in society today, sexual activity carries long-term ramifications. So you would say that, let's say that an adult male gives a child, or it doesn't really matter, I will say adult male because it's got a penis, or whatever. An adult person with a penis gives a child some candy, and that child fondles the person's penis in exchange for the candy, right? You would argue that that action carries no long-term ramifications?
In exchange for the candy. Well, it really depends on the circumstance, but I'm assuming in that harmless little story that you give, probably not.
So when you say like depends on the circumstance,
similar to how I mean, if many people are around the kid, then like perhaps the people will pressure the kid into thinking that it's harmful. I would disagree. But let's say it's some of the problems that as you go into this, and I understand you doing it as an adult, but when you say things like, well, it depends on the circumstance, what you're showing me is that you as an adult are able to distinguish between times when it would be okay and not okay. And my argument goes back to informed consent, that a child would never be able to distinguish when it is okay or not okay. Yeah, and my argument is that it's not about being informed when you give the consent. That's completely irrelevant. It's more of whether or not there is harm involved in the action. You see, you guys have a problem when a baby, a kid comes over and, and in exchange for candy, touches the adult's face. But instead of the face, the kid touches the dick instead. Then you guys have a problem. But why should there be a problem when both actions are completely harmless?
Because the problem is that sexual activity in society today carries a much different ramification with it than non-sexual activity. So, for instance, we could say that these two actions are equivalent, right? It's just the child touching the skin of another person, and we might be able to make that statement in a vacuum. But in society as it exists today, if I tell my friend that I want to touch his face, he might look at me strangely and let me do it. But if I tell him that I want to touch his penis, there would be a much different interaction there, right? Because these are
but that's really not because touching a dick, like touching a face, is harmful. It's just because society perceives it as such. And I think it's way more accurate if you want to determine whether or not an action is harmful or not to consider society, because obviously society doesn't affect whether or not it's harmful or not. It's the action itself that we need to look at.
So I feel like if you want to make this argument, so I will say that in certain hypothetical worlds, your argument may be correct. But the problem is that I think that when you're weighing the ramifications of an action, you have to take into account how society will respond to that.
That's like basically saying that, okay, in the 70s, gays were being discriminated. But would you now say that, during the 70s, revealing that you are a gay and having sex with a gay man is wrong? The society argument, I think, just because society is backwards and they don't consider the action good at that time, therefore it can be considered wrong. I think it's very flawed.
So I agree with you that an appeal to tradition to determine whether or not something is morally right or morally condemnable is bad. I would never use an appeal to tradition. What I'm talking about right now, though, is the very real kind of like mental consequence of doing something that society kind of bucks. So, for instance, and going back to the gay example...
Then you're using appeal to tradition, aren't you?
So, well, it sounds like that, but going back to the gay example, for instance, even if society is fully against, homosexual relationships, it is entirely possible that two informed and consenting men could engage in a consensual homosexual relationship. Maybe they would have to keep it hidden from society or something so that they wouldn't find out. But to them, like, no personal damage or whatever would be caused, right? Because they're capable of engaging in that relationship and making all the necessary considerations to engage in that relationship.
Yeah.
As it stands today, because of our societal views on sex, it doesn't seem like children are capable of engaging in those kinds of sexual relationships because they can't weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah,
I guess like if I were to draw like a similar thing to try to make your analogy fit more, so like we could look at like interracial relationships. Maybe could we do that as a stand-in instead of gay relationships? We could say interracial relationships.
Well, what do you mean by that?
So like, well, since people used to say interracial relationships are wrong, wouldn't you say that then because society says interracial relationships are wrong, that they shouldn't be allowed to do that or whatever?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say that. Just because society considers those relationships wrong doesn't mean they shouldn't be allowed to do it.
Sure. So like, let's say that there was a, this analogy is getting incredibly hypothetical, but like, let's say that there was an actual punishment, there was an actual punishment for somebody engaging in friendship with somebody of a different race or whatever, right? Let's say that exists, right? That if a 45-year-old person of a race were to engage in a friendship with a 5-year-old person of a race, I would say that to some extent that's an immoral behavior on the part of the adult, even though there's nothing necessarily wrong with the interracial relationships, because the child isn't able to fully understand the ramifications of engaging in that relationship. That the relationship itself might not be wrong, but but because
you're just talking about whether or not we should do the activity right now. I'm not like right now. Yeah, it wouldn't be beneficial to have sexual contact with children and like possess child pornography or upload child pornography. That doesn't mean that those actions are wrong. It's just like in the context of now, it could be considered wrong. But I don't think we're talking about in the context of now. We're talking about whether or not the activity is actually wrong. So.
Well, I guess because right and wrong to some extent are just to harp on the analogy a little bit more, just because I feel like it doesn't exactly fit. Like I think there's also like a big difference between two consenting adults being able to choose whether or not they want to go against like a societal trend versus somebody who's too young to understand what it means to do that, to do it as well. Right. And a 5-year-old, because doesn't really have the moral consideration, the ability to, or not moral consideration, doesn't have the ability to morally consider what is right or wrong, that the child can't fully understand. It goes back to the informed consent thing. Yeah.
And now I think I'll state why I think that you don't have to be completely informed to give consent. I think that's extremely ridiculous. And that's because, when you go up and hug somebody, that would be considered invasion of privacy. But let's say,
just so that we keep things like very even. Can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm just about to expand it.
Okay, sorry. All right.
Yeah, but let's say a child, it's he's not that mentally developed, and that's why people say that they're not able to consent to sex. But let's say you come over to a child, you hug him. and the child hugs back, that you would consider a consensual act. The child doesn't fully know the social ramifications of hugging, but you still consider that a consensual act. Similar to giving a child a pie. You're feeding the child. He doesn't know the full social ramifications of high cholesterol, high calorie pie. But you don't say that you're force feeding a child until he reaches the age of 3. You'd say that he consented to eating the pie, although he's not fully informed in doing that action. So what you said, that you need to be informed to give consent, I think is extremely flawed.
So to look at these two examples, so the thing about hugging is that there is oftentimes, at least in every culture that I'm aware of, and there might be somewhere this is different, in which case I would make a different moral argument here. I don't think there is a long-term ramification to hugging. Except for in an incredibly rare number of cases. Have I ever heard of somebody either extremely regretting giving a hug when they were younger, or having like severe emotional or mental problems because they gave a hug when they were younger? So I don't think that giving a hug is on the same level. Like, there's not much consideration that needs to be done when it comes to giving hugs for the long-term ramifications of hugging.
Yeah, but how does that factor... But that factor about whether or not it causes a long-term ramification, I don't think that has any logical connection to whether or not the act, a sexual act of a child, is right or wrong. How would there be a logical connection?
Well, the connection right now comes from the fact that in society, we have decided that sexual activity carries with it certain gravity, and that a person who is of a certain age isn't really able to weigh that gravity against their decision. They're just not able to.
You sure you aren't appealing to tradition? Because I really don't give a fuck about what society thinks. I'm more, inclined to, to find out whether or not the action is actually right or wrong. And yeah, I'm gonna reiterate like several examples of sexual acts of men in Africa, pygmy men, who where the sexual act of basically letting a boy suckle the man's tit to calm him down, and evidence of children as young as the age of like 3 or 4 already wanting to engage in sexual acts. It's a psychological evidence. It is a huge evidence in like child sexuality circles that children really right when they're born already have sexual desire, and then really at really young ages they start making out with they can start making out with kids in the same age as them, like 7-year-olds making out together. But then there's a difference when you guys say that children should not be able to have sex with an adult, when really there's absolutely no evidence to show that there's any negative emotional reactions, consequences, as long as the sexual interaction between an adult and a child is perfectly consensual. So do you have any evidence to show that if it's a perfectly consensual sexual relationship, there is long-term harm? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, there can be, but all of that would be rooted in societal norms. So the way that you're kind of phrasing this question is that you're kind of trying, if we have a moral discussion that is like absent of society, a lot of stuff gets kind of weird there, because most of our morals are kind of built around living in a society. Like, we could construct moral systems where thievery or murder is permissible outside of like a certain society. So I guess in terms of...
But as I said, like, even whether or not you live in 1960s America or right now, I think we can still say that gay marriage should be allowed and we should not discriminate gays. Society is completely... It should not matter what society thinks.
Sure. So I feel like we're kind of conflating two different issues here. And there's one issue where I could agree with you. If you want to have a discussion on like, I think that the way society views sex is very wrong, that sex should just be the interacting with another person's genitals and it shouldn't carry any more gravity beyond that, that is an argument that can be made. And that's an argument that you can defend in a lot of ways. But the problem is that we kind of have to assume that society is the way it is when we make these when we kind of consider the ability of a younger person to consent to said action. Okay, so here's an analogy to kind of illustrate that. Okay, so let's say that if you color with blue crayons, there are a lot of people in society that when you turn 18, they will beat the shit out of you if you've ever colored with a blue crayon before. They just fucking hate blue crayons.
Okay.
They absolutely fucking hate blue crayons. Let's say that somebody is 25 years old and they're going to say, you know what? I don't give a fuck. I'm going to draw with this blue crayon. That person is drawing with the crayon, understanding the ramifications of his actions, that people in society might attack him for drawing with that crayon. And, that's fine. Let's say that now a 5-year-old is coloring and an adult wanders by and the adult hands that child a blue crayon and says, okay, well, if you want to color with this, knock yourself out. Now, we can get into an argument all day on whether or not, drawing with blue crayons should be morally permissible or not, but that's not really what the argument is about. The argument is, does that 5-year-old child understand the ramifications of drawing with that blue crayon, whether or not drawing with crayons is a morally bad or morally good action? So in the case of pedophilia here, right, like could pedophilia be okay in like another world? Like, I mean, I said I would grant you that, like, if we lived in a society where sexual activity didn't matter, where people like walked up on the street and like slapped dicks with each other and like touched each other and it wasn't really a big deal at all, then in that world, I mean, pedophilia probably wouldn't be a big deal. It'd be like hugging a kid or giving him a shoulder rub or something like that. But as it exists in society today, sexual activity carries an enormous stigma with it that we can't ignore that. And when anybody is making a consideration of whether or not they can perform an action, they have to understand the long-term ramifications of that action, whether or not the action itself might be morally good or morally bad. That's kind of a separate discussion would be what I would say.
I think it's like a really irrelevant ramble, because I think really we should just stick the discussion to whether or not we think having sexual acts with children is morally permissible. Because going back to your blue crayon analogy, in that context where the person get beaten up for using a blue crayon, in that context, I don't think he should use that blue crayon. Similar to right now, I don't think a pedophile should have a sexual interaction with a child or possess child pornography. It'd probably be beneficial for him in this kind of society not to do it. But never in that analogy that you give would you say that it was wrong to use a fucking blue crayon. So as I said, it's then what are you talking about, buddy?
Sure. So like in this then,
let's just can we just talk about whether or not you think like having sexual acts with a child is an adult having sexual acts with a child is good or bad in your opinion?
Sure. So if that's the case, then we probably don't disagree on much, but I feel like the way that you're approaching the argument then is very strange. And that the way that you should approach this argument then is you should just say that, well, sexual activity really shouldn't carry any stigma with it at all. Because you could... Well, yeah, then why not? Why not just make that argument instead of jumping straight to pedophilia? Because pedophilia would be a natural extension. Well, because I would say that like pedophilia would be like a natural extension of that system if you established that as a foundational belief, right? If you say that like, because then anything fits in, right? Handshakes don't carry any social stigma. Head pats don't carry any social stigma. Sexual activity shouldn't carry any social stigma. Well, then from there you would say that, okay, well, any sexual activity then shouldn't really be that big of a deal.
Oh, hold on, buddy. So basically you're saying that if society was more cool with pedophilia, then you'd support pedophilia.
Well, if society was set up, if society was set up in such a way that pedophilic actions didn't carry potentially long-term negative mental or social ramifications with them, then then the child does have the ability more to consent with that activity because there isn't long-term ramifications that he's not capable of conceiving. So
basically, you are absolutely fine with a child fucking an adult.
In a society,
if we live in a utopian society,
where there's absolute, I mean, like you have to be really careful with the way you phrase this because society doesn't work this way right now. But if we lived in an absolutely utopian society where there was no stigma whatsoever on any type of sexual activity, then you could probably make that argument. I don't know, maybe you would dig into other arguments for why people should or shouldn't do things, but
it kind of makes sense. Just because we're ahead of our time, doesn't mean that because. There's nothing wrong with pedophilic relationships.
Well, first you have...
So it's kind of our job, if we want to reduce the social stigma of sex in society, to make these arguments supporting pedophilia. Otherwise, how else would we improve society?
Sure. So the way that you would approach this conversation, if this was genuinely your goal, though, is you would be arguing against sexual norms in society. I think would be the better way to take it, rather than jumping right to the most extreme ends of what our sexual norms of what our sexual norms influence. And also, I don't necessarily know if you could make that pedophilia should be okay, because there might be other, say, psychological or medical factors that would be considered there as well.
Yeah, no, basically there's tons of psychological both studies and anecdotal evidence which shows that really if it's consensual, if it's not abusive or manipulative or involves any kind of coercion, then it's perfectly a consensual relationship between a minor and an adult, has absolutely no negative psychological effects. In fact, it's actually pretty good. Obviously, we're aware of the benefits of intimacy and sexual acts, so that carries the same thing the same way with children. It's good. It's good for both parties if it's consensual.
But the problem though is that because we're third-party observers, it's impossible for us to ever make the determination on whether or not that's a consensual relationship, right? This is why all relationships that have massive power imbalances are generally seen as immoral, because it's impossible for a third-party observer to ever say whether or not the people within that relationship are truly consenting.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Otherwise, what are you, just because you're a third party, then you don't trust the studies? Then you wouldn't think that any study towards human sexuality, having like polls on whether or not people think sadomasochism is good, you wouldn't think that they were reliable at all.
Well, so this is different. Because sadomasochism is like BDSM and shit is stuff that's engaged in with consenting adults that aren't usually approaching it from wildly different power dynamics. So like an example that I would give here would be like an employee-employer relationship. These are generally seen as immoral because it's impossible from a third party to tell if any party is truly consenting. Like, is it possible that a boss could ask an employee that a boss could ask an employee if they wanted to go out on a date, and for that employee to truly say yes? Like, it's possible that the employee wants to and they would say yes, but we would consider the employee's ability to truly consent there as compromised because there might be ramifications if they say no. So we would rule that all of those types of relationships, even if some hypothetically could be okay, we would rule that those are all immoral because of that.
Yeah, there are definitely like power dynamics involved in relationships, but that just because there's probably a larger degree of power dynamic between a minor and an adult than an adult and between a minor and adult than an adult and adult doesn't mean it applies with both cases. And sure, many people think that children, because they're less mentally developed and the larger power dynamic, it therefore justifies the fact that children can't consent to sex. But you can pontificate as much as you want, but the psychological evidence shows that there's absolutely no harm. It exists as little harm in minor adult relationships than typical adult relationships. There exists no more harm. So yeah.
I'm trying to stay away from whether or not harm is caused, because we're looking at generally justice as a philosophical argument. I mean, if we want to jump into like data-driven arguments for whether or not pedophilia causes psychological harm, I'm pretty sure that's not an argument that you would come out on top on, just because so many pedophilic relationships are non-consensual. I think you would agree with that, right?
No, I completely disagree with that. That's complete bullshit. And if you can provide evidence that shows that most pedophilic relationships are abuse, please show it to me. The evidence actually shows the complete opposite. So,
wait. I'm just curious. Do you have a study that you cite or something for that, or?
Yeah, citations galore. Want me to give it to you afterwards?
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I'm just digging through Google Scholar real quick. A review of 45 studies clearly demonstrated that sexually abused children had more symptoms than non-abused children, with abuse.
Yes, that's what people always do. They keep on falsely misrepresenting. Consensual minor adult relationships is completely different from sexual abuse.
Well, I'm pretty sure that in the literature they would consider all underage relationships would be considered abusive relationships.
And that's the flaw with the literature, because really there's a complete difference between consensual and sexual abuse. Because when we use the term sexual abuse, we're basically saying that some kind of coercion and manipulation was involved, and therefore it's not consensual. But if it was perfectly consensual, then yeah, you shouldn't classify it as sexual abuse. And you probably say that, you'll probably give the statistic like many people have done, like Jeff Holiday, who basically says that, okay, sexual abuse children, they grow up to be more emotionally traumatic. And I completely agree with that. But you all keep on misrepresenting and saying that because of that, therefore we should ban consensual pedophilic relationships. And that's just misrepresenting stats. Because there's once again, I'm going to stress, a difference between child abuse, non-consensual sexual relationships, and perfectly consensual minor adult relationships.
Yeah, but I think that this all kind of goes back to the informed consent thing. Like, for instance, let's say that I were to go around a bunch of first graders, and I were to offer them, say, for all of their allowance, for like $20, I were to offer them, like 20 shares of some penny stock, and I were to do that to every first grader. That those first graders don't really have the capacity to make that decision because they don't understand the ramifications of investing their money or giving up their $20 to me in exchange for those securities. However, some of them, might end up being millionaires when they grow up. But if they did, it was just by chance. They didn't really at the time understand. And to cite those kids that got really lucky on their penny stocks and go, well, look, it turned out really well for them. And that kind of misses the point, right? The idea is that, well, at the time they made that decision, they really didn't have any idea how it would turn out for them. Like, if it turned out well, that's awesome. But we'd have no idea at the time, right? Much the same way that a 25 or 30-year-old person engaging in a sexual relationship with a 5 or 6-year-old person, that 5 or 6-year-old is opening themselves up to a plethora of potential negative things, like ignoring all of the possible physical abuse or coercion or physical coercion that could exist, which could easily be done with an older person to a younger person. Just the social ramifications are extreme, and the child is just not able to consider those at all. Maybe some will grow up and not care about it, which is cool for them, but at the time then they were considering it, they didn't really truly have the ability to consider whether or not they would have those regrets or not.
Yeah, once again, I stress that, like, I don't think it's like as you say, you don't, when you give a baby a pie, you don't say that you're force feeding him. And I said that you don't have, so I don't think that you need to be completely informed to give consent.
Well, like, to go back
also
to that. To go back to that example, because I was just those are two. You gave hugging and getting a pie. Like, I would argue that it's morally wrong for parents to overfeed children and cause them to be obese. I mean, because you started bringing up like fat and cholesterol on it. If you have a fat child that's like 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, yeah, I would absolutely argue that is a moral wrong from the parents, because they're pretty much forcing the child to grow up and have a whole bunch of health impacts and whatnot that the child isn't cognizant of. Yeah, I would absolutely say that's immoral.
Okay. Yeah. So it really depends on like the circumstance. So you're against parents overfeeding a child, and what? So you think that the parent should be arrested if he gives? You think that there should be limitations in law that shows that you can't give that much pie to a child?
Maybe, maybe not, but we're just having like a philosophical discussion on ethics. I don't know what the exact punishment should be. I'm more just interested in judging an action as being morally wrong or morally right. And I would argue that overfeeding a child and causing them to be fat is a moral wrong. Now, pragmatically, I don't know what the punishment for that should be.
I think that even if you make the child fat, which I think many parents do, I don't think it'd be good to put them in prison. I don't think that'd be considered a moral act. But,
sure, but we're not there. It's just passing judgment on the action itself of overfeeding the child would be something that I would consider probably morally wrong, because the child can, quote unquote, consent to eating the food. It tastes yummy and it even makes them happy while they're doing it. But that child is taking on a whole host of health and mental and social issues as it grows older, that it has no idea that it could potentially ruin its life as a result of that.
Oh yeah. Oh, but there's I think we need to make the difference between an act that is wrong, that you think is wrong, and whether or not there should be a law to prevent that act. Because I think that smoking is pretty bad. Because it does. Just for that little pleasure, you fuck up your health. I don't think there should be a law banning, smoking.
These are fundamentally different things.
We're having a philosophical discussion, as you say.
Well, yeah. Well, we can even. Well, no. I'm saying that the comparison of smoking to force feeding is philosophically different, and we can actually dip into law a little bit there if you want. So, smoking in and of itself should not be seen as in my philosophy, because I'm big on personal freedom, shouldn't be seen as a morally wrong act, because you can do what you want to your own body. Now, secondhand smoke, however, is kind of forcing other people to deal with your smoking. And if we look at the law there, I kind of agree with current legal standards where you are allowed to smoke in your own home. You can do whatever you want. But if you go to like a restaurant or a place where food is served, you're not allowed to smoke around other people, right? So there's a difference between smoking yourself versus, like giving a child a cigarette, right? Would be more akin to the pedophilia thing, because now you have an adult that knows the ramifications of the action, and then you give a cigarette to a child. Do you think like a children should be allowed to smoke if given a cigarette from an adult?
If a child should he be allowed to smoke?
Yeah.
I think that he should be legally allowed. That doesn't mean that he should do it.
Well, like, do you think it would be morally, do you think it'd be a morally neutral act for an adult who's 20, 30, 40 years old to offer a 4 or 5 year old a cigarette and ask the child?
I think that'd be morally wrong. He should be allowed to do it, but that'd be morally wrong.
Sure. Well, we're not worried about allowed. We're talking about the moral or ethical side, right? Yeah. So that would be
I think that'd be morally wrong.
Here's just kind of like a general question. Do you think that a child of, say, 5 or 6 should be allowed to sign a contract?
Do I think?
So let's say, for instance, let's say okay.
I think that he should be allowed legally.
Well, again, I'm just only talking about the moral ethical side. Only talking about the moral ethical side. Do you think that it would be if, let's say, I'm 25 years old and I tell a kid, listen, I'm going to give you this car, this toy car right now, okay? But you're going to sign a contract, and when you get older, when you're 18, you've got to pay me $100 a month for a whole year if you want me to give you this toy car now. And the kid is like, okay, sure, I'll sign it because I want the car now, right? Do you think that that's an okay act? That it'd be morally okay for the kid to sign that contract?
Oh no, absolutely not. He should be, difference. I think he should be allowed to make that choice, but I think morally, I don't think that is good. Obviously, because he's 4 years old. But yeah, I need to because I think that we're making these little comparisons, and I like to say that there's a huge difference between. You might disagree with me because I'm leaning towards abolishing age of consent laws for everything. Even like voting and like signing legal contracts. But even if you disagree with me on that, there's a difference between that and me wanting to eliminate age of consent laws for sex.
Well, I guess it seems like in all of these cases where it has to do with overeating, cigarette smoking, or signing contracts, it seems like you understand that a child can't truly consent to the long-term ramifications of this. But for sexual activity, you seem to think that doesn't matter. Why?
Because one, in terms of smoking at 4, before that, I just want to really clarify before we go on.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on, because basically, if I say I want to, not have age of consent laws for hugging, that doesn't mean that I want to, eliminate age of consent laws for everything else. So basically, you can agree with me to eliminate age of consent laws for sex, but disagree with me if I want to eliminate age of consent laws for everything else. So both people keep on making the comparison, and I'm thinking that they should not make the link because both of those issues are completely different. Now, in terms of this, I think it's wrong for an uninformed child of 4, 5, and 6 to probably vote or smoke or sign a legal contract. But compare that to sex is because one act is harmful to them, while the other isn't. And sexual acts is not at all harmful to them. It actually benefits them greatly. So, benefits them greatly is something that we would have to look over in terms of psychological research. I don't think that's true. We would have to go somewhere. That is perfectly true. So,
we would have to. Maybe after you can show me some studies and I'll look over it. But I'm going to remain neutral on that topic right now.
Cool.
So I'm curious. So
it's great that unlike other people, you're not completely making the absolute false statement that whenever you have a sexual act with a child, it's immediately bad, and there's absolutely no evidence to show that at all.
Yeah, sure. What you say about physical contact and whatnot is true. That could be borne out between newborns and parents. The thing though is that what it sounds to me like, and this is so I'm wavering a little bit into the maybe you're a troll. I don't really care for the sake of the argument, but just in that, it seems like if what you really wanted to do was challenge society's standards and norms on sexual activity, that's actually an incredibly important topic, I think, and it's one that deserves a lot of discussion because there is a lot of negative ramification that follows our current societal attitudes on sexual activity. And that's something that I agree a lot. But we can't pretend that those societal attitudes don't exist and then try to advocate for other kind of moral or ethical things independent of society, especially when you're talking about dealing with somebody that can't truly give an informed consensual decision on that topic, not understanding how society will react. I'm sorry, that's kind of loaded. Is that like that? That's kind of my problem with the thing. That like, if you wanted to ask me, like in a vacuum, like if we lived in a universe where everybody had sex all the time and nobody cared about it at all, and it wasn't a big deal, do you think it's that bad for kids and adults to have sex? Like, well, I mean, I guess in that universe, probably not. But that's not the one we live in. And when we talk about giving consideration to actions and the ramifications of those actions, we have to consider the society that we live in, right? Because the kid isn't going to grow up in a vacuum. He's going to grow up in the society that we live in today, where he has to deal with the consequences of his actions in the society we live in today. Right? Yeah, and I completely agree. And I also like to, since you brought that up, there are huge amounts of children. They perfectly like a huge portion of children who they did, in fact, have perfectly harmless consensual relationships with adults. But simply because of society's perception that that kind of minor adult relationship is harmful, then it brainwashes them in thinking that that relationship is harmful, and because of that, then they think that they were molested and raped, and therefore, a harmless relationship in their mind, it becomes harmful, which is absolutely horrible, and I think that's society's fault. Sure, but like if you truly believe that,
basically, your argument is extremely flawed in the sense that, like, even in 70s, as I said, even in like 1800s America, you'd still say we should have black rights, even though if you say that if you go support a black person in public, you'd have negative ramifications. You see, like, there's a difference. Yeah, but there's a difference between like an 18 or 19-year-old going to support a black person in public versus giving a 5-year-old a sign and telling them to go off and do it. That even though it might be good to support civil rights, and even a child supporting civil rights, the act itself is good, it's the fact that you're forcing somebody to do it who doesn't really understand the ramifications of their actions. Like, that child protesting doesn't understand that they might be shot or ran over by a horse or whatever in the 1800s, I don't know, whatever. Like, that child doesn't understand the ramifications of their actions. Is the problem. And then I think we're going in circles because you think that like being informed is necessary. I don't think that it is. And well, like what about for something like an STD? What if sex with STDs is something that you're capable of considering? Like, is herpes really that big of a deal? When so many in society are like HPV for young women or whatnot, like, are these big deals? Like, do you think that a 5 or 6-year-old could truly decide whether or not he wants to have sex with somebody who has like HIV or herpes or something? Like, would they really be able to make that decision, or should all people with STDs not be allowed to engage in these relationships then? Or I think that, like, once again, I would say that legally they should be allowed to do it, but not legally, just ethically. Ethically, I don't think that they should actually do it. But why would you draw that line there, though? A person, unless the kid, like 5-6-year-old kid, like somehow he's really suicidal and wants STD, then sure, go ahead. Well, not all STDs kill you. Herpes can be relatively harmless depending on what you get. So let's say that like a 35-year-old wants to engage a 6-year-old in a sexual relationship. The 35-year-old says, well, this will be a lot of fun, but also I have herpes. Do you think that the 6-year-old has the mental faculty to weigh having herpes for the rest of his life and treating that with the pleasure of having sex with that person or whatever, assuming it was consensual? Do you really think the 6-year-old would have the capability to really weigh those decisions? Probably not. So what? So would it be morally permissible for the adult to pursue that pedophilic relationship with that 6-year-old? I would not think that is morally permissible at all. And I think we're having obviously. So, or for any person of age, for that matter. Unless somebody wants STDs, so. Well, but then, so STDs are a very real risk of sexual activity. This is just one of a handful of issues that you have to carry with you when you engage in sexual activity. Like, the person might say they don't have STDs, but there's always the chance, like if I'm sleeping with somebody and I don't use a condom, even if they say they don't have STDs, there's a chance they could. That's something that I, as an adult, am able to consider when I have sex. How would a child be able to consider those types of things? How would a 5-year-old know that, well, maybe this person that says he doesn't have STDs actually does? Like, how would a child of 5 or 6 actually be able to know that, to weigh that? As I said, you kind of differentiate between, like, one person is informed and the other isn't, and I don't think that should be a factor. And I don't think there's any logical connection with the being informed. And also the fact that, okay, there is risk of a child getting manipulated into having sex with an adult, and then after that he gets STDs. That happens also with normal adult relationships. So if you want to, just reduce the risk for everything, then it'd be consistent for you to say ban all relationships in general.
So,
because you see, there's many exploitation going on everywhere.
So we have to be careful.
So it's why don't we just ban all of them?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a straw man. I'm not saying that we need to reduce the risk of everything. For instance, we are allowed to drive cars. Driving cars is an inherently risky activity, though. Every time I step into my car or sit in my car, I'm understanding that there is a chance that, you know, I might die as I'm driving my car or whatever, right? However, giving somebody the ability to do that doesn't truly understand the ramifications is much different, right? We wouldn't give like a 2-year-old with a booster seat the ability to drive the car around because, well, one, it's a safety hazard, but like even to themselves personally, they don't understand that they might get killed doing it. My goal isn't to reduce all risk. Every time you engage in a sexual action, there's going to be some risk involved, right? But the difference is that I, as a 28, 29-year-old man, I'm capable of recognizing those risks and then accepting them or not. Like, I can truly say, I'm going to go ahead and bang this chick, and I understand I might get an STD by doing it. Maybe it's a small chance, but yeah, I understand that, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. There's a difference between me doing it versus a 5-year-old doing it, when the 5-year-old really has no idea, like, what are the risks? How are they? Like, if I got an STD, I know how it would impact me. I would have to go to the hospital. I'd get tested. Maybe I would get medication. Like, I know all of the ramifications, right? I know the consequences and everything. Whereas like a 5-year-old has no idea how they're going to handle the rest of their life if they acquire an STD. How could they possibly weigh that risk when they engage in a sexual relationship with somebody? And if they can't weigh that risk, then how is it morally okay for somebody that can weigh that risk to exploit that person and engage in that sexual relationship?
Okay, firstly, in terms of, I think it's a very implausible scenario for like, okay, so unless there's like a study which shows that, okay, minor adult relationships, they're more prone to contracting unwarranted STDs compared to adult
No, it doesn't have to be more
maybe.
prone. It can be the same percentage as the normal population.
In which case then, because, then you have to weigh pros and cons. That, sure, a child is more prone to contracting STDs, if you will.
So what you're saying right now about weighing pros and cons is important, but my whole argument is that as a child can't weigh pros and cons. That's the point. So if the cons were ever outweighing the pros, they would have no way of knowing that, which is why they can't give informed consent.
And so we're going to weigh pros and cons. We're going to see that, if you allow sexual acts between an adult and child, yes, there's the con that they could manipulate it and contract STDs, but then that is not enough of a justification. The few cases where they do contract STDs, therefore we ban all mutually beneficial sexual relationships between a child and an adult. That's completely ridiculous. As I said, there's risk for indulging in every kind of activity, and we're not going to violate the human rights of people just so that we can reduce that small little risk. It doesn't at all make sense.
So you keep jumping. So you keep jumping between this thing where like there's risk involved, so we need to get rid of it. I'm not arguing against the risk. So let's say, for instance, you had a room full of 100 people, okay? Let's say that all 100 of these people made a bet to double their money, but there was a 1% chance that they would lose that money, okay? Let's say that all of these people made that bet. Now, let's say those 100 people, 99 of them doubled their money, and one of them lost all their money, right? As a result of that 1 to 100 bet. You would argue that that's okay. You know, all those people knew what they were getting into. You know, one person lost, that sucks. The other 99 got ahead, that's fine. But the results aren't even really relevant. It's more that all of them knew the risk going in. Now, if we took another 100 people and we put them all in a room and we made that same deal where all of them's portfolios was put up to double or nothing, and there was a 99 to 1 chance that it worked, we would argue that that was immoral every single time. Even though 99 people won and only one person lost, we wouldn't say, well, only one person lost, it's not that big of a deal, it doesn't happen to many. We would argue, well, no, every single one of those people who were put into that circumstance, that was immoral. They didn't realize that that's what they were giving up. They didn't have informed consent for their entire portfolio being gambled that way. That's why the 2008 housing crash was such a big deal, because a lot of people's retirement funds were being gambled with in ways that they weren't really aware of, whether or not they won or lost on it.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to what is your point with that? I'm
so
sorry,
my point is that if you were to say that, like, well, only 2 or 3% of children that engage in sexual relationships got an STD, so it's not wrong because it's not affecting that many kids, I would argue it's not about the percentage of how many kids actually acquire an STD. It's the fact that all of them were risking it, but not all of them really understood the risks that they were taking. That even if there was a 2% chance of acquiring some sort of sexually transmitted disease by engaging in a sexual act, even if 98% of children didn't acquire an STD by doing so, none of them should be allowed to engage in that sexual act because they're not aware that they're risking that at the time that they engage in that sexual activity.
And I'm gonna and then we'll go back to the whole informed consent thing, because
well, yeah, of course, which is the centerpiece.
Whether or
of
not
argument,
they're fully aware of the long-term ramifications of that act or not should not at all prevent them from approving in that decision, because regardless whether or not they were completely informed in giving the consent or not, the fact is that most relationships between a minor and an adult is perfectly mutually beneficial, good for both parties. And just because of that risk, you then violate the human rights and say that all relationships between a minor and an adult should not be allowed. Just because they're not perfectly informed, you're going to reduce the happiness of that kind of relationship. It doesn't make sense to me. There's no logical connection. Do you not see that there isn't a logical connection? Yeah,
so I think that we're getting lost on this kind of results-oriented thing.
Wait.
Well, but we might actually have like a philosophical disagreement here that would make I'm not sure if you truly believe this or not. Let's say that I put 100 people in the room, and I didn't tell them that I was going to do this, but I put 100 people in the room, and 98 of them get to leave the room, and 2 of them I chop an arm off, but the 98 that left all gain $1 million, right? We could argue that in this world, the total gain in happiness is actually massive. 98 people left a room with $1 million, 2 of them had their arms chopped off, but nobody knew what was going to happen going into that room. They didn't even know. They showed up for like a church seminar or something. Would you argue that because the result of that was an overall increase in happiness, that it was a good action? Or would you say that's not good because the people didn't know what they were truly consenting to when they entered that room?
There's a difference between that analogy and, like, purely conscious children who
Can you explain what the difference is?
The difference is, I think that the difference really is that... Okay, can you repeat that analogy again? I'm sorry.
100 people walk into a room. They think they're there for a church seminar. When they get into that room, they're informed that 98 of them have been selected to win $1 million. 2 of them are losing an arm. It's all done at random. 98 people leave the room with $1 million more. 2 people leave the room with 1 arm less. It sounds like, from your point of view, you're arguing that this is a morally righteous thing because the overall net gain in happiness was great. 2 people lost out, and that kind of sucks, but 98 people came out ahead. That was great. My argument would be that even though there's a net gain in happiness, it's not morally righteous because they didn't truly consent to this when they entered the room. They didn't know they were risking an arm for $1 million. So it's not right to say that it was good just because the outcome was good.
Your analogy that 2 people, I wouldn't say that there will be a net gain.
Okay, we can make it $10 million.
Like 98%,
we can make it $10 million then.
So
we can make it $10 million a person, or $100 million per person then, if you want. Whatever it needs to be for there to be a net gain in happiness where 2 people lose.
Okay. Well, Oh, well, if that's the case, then, okay, now I understand you. If that's the case, then, yeah, even if they did not consent, then, yeah, there's a net benefit to all of them. I'd still say that scenario is morally permissible. So, yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's the philosophical disagreement.
Sure, but I don't know if you truly agree with that, because we can go down, because now we're in utilitarianistic territory. We can go down a lot of roads. Here's a question. Let's say that there's a race of people who would benefit the society overall if we could enslave that group of people. Let's say there are 500,000 people that exist in the United States that we could enslave, and by enslaving them, we dramatically increase the quality of living for every other person in the United States. Would you argue that the overall net gain in happiness achieved by enslaving those 500,000 people make it okay to enslave those people?
Oh yeah, sure. So it really is about pros and cons, isn't it? And
sure,
so,
if you think so. Okay, so then you would argue that you're like a strict utilitarianist?
Excuse me?
So you would be like a strict utilitarianist then. If you could sacrifice any number of people to increase the overall happiness in society, you would always take that action.
I'm not fully familiar with the term utilitarianist, but
Okay.
yeah, it's all about net good, weighing pros and cons, and going back to the, the adult child argument, sexual argument, the pedophile argument. There's a risk of STDs, but that's a con. But the pro of the majority enjoying a sexual relationship obviously far outweighs it. Similar to there's exploitation in the porn industry, but the joy of producing and watching porn far outweighs the exploitation.
Yeah, I understand.
It's all about weighing.
So, okay, so then let's say that there is a group of 1 million people, okay? Or these are all arbitrary numbers. We'll say like 10,000.
Are you sure that all these little philosophical wanderings you're providing relevant to the discussion?
Yeah, well, so essentially a utilitarianist would argue that there is no morally right or wrong act, that the act itself is not moral or immoral, but rather we look at outcomes and outcomes only. Are you familiar with like the trolley problem?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so the trolley problem is there's one person on one track, and then there's 4 people in another track. There's a trolley heading down the train tracks, and it's headed for the 4 people. Would you pull a lever that would send that train instead down the track with 1 person versus the one with 4 people? I'm guessing you would pull the lever, right?
Yeah, I get you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then another extension of that trolley problem, and I'm guessing I know your answer too. Let's say there's a train moving down a track. It's going to run over 4 people. And there's a really, really, really fat person who's on an overpass that's looking below. Would you push that person onto the tracks if you knew it would cause the train to come to a stop and the 4 people would get out and be okay?
Like push that one person, if the only way to stop the train is to push that one person.
Yeah, you push one person onto the tracks in order to save the 4 people.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
Yeah, of course, sure. Yeah, so like it sounds like, and I don't have like a huge philosophy background, but it sounds like you're a utilitarianist, right? So
Cool.
the problem with this, I say problem, is that there are a lot of kind of logic problems that you have to work yourself through that can lead basically what I'm saying is it can lead you to some troubling areas. One, I guess, would be your pedophilia area. But here's the thing. So let's say that somebody comes up to you, a stranger comes up to you, and the stranger says, "Hello, I am dying because my kidneys are shot. I need you to give me 1 kidney." Do you think that person should have the power to morally compel you? And then let's say that you were a perfect moral machine where you always took the morally correct action. You would be okay with being taken to a hospital and then giving your kidney to that person because you can sacrifice 1 kidney for a minor discomfort in order to save another person's life. You'd be okay being morally compelled to do that? And then that could be extrapolated to all of society, that everybody should be morally compelled to donate a kidney anytime somebody needs a kidney. That should be a moral compulsion.
Okay, now that's a tricky question because it kind of goes back to because if we would just isolate that incident, then okay, we'd probably want to force that person to give up the kidney. But in doing so, you provide a culture that basically a kind of authoritarian culture, which basically forcing anybody to give up something in the name of what society considers right. I think a good analogy to that is the fact that I did consider whether or not killing presidents would be good for society, since killing dictators, because dictators are extremely harmful to society. And so then I had the thought, okay, why not we kill a dictator? And then he's very influential and harmful, so we just kill him and everything would be better. But I think that it's flawed in that regard, because if you start killing people whom you disagree with, then you create this culture where, okay, you basically kill everybody who you disagree with. And I think in terms of the long-term effects in society, that will just create, an authoritarian
structure. And a utilitarian would take this into account. And a utilitarian would take this into account. But I could argue that same slippery slope with your enslavement thing, right? That, well, maybe if 500,000 people being enslaved works, maybe they would want to enslave another 500,000 or enslave another 2 million or something.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, but what the hell does all of this have to do with the fucking pedophile argument, buddy?
So,
maybe we should go back to that, because I think our audience will probably be like, confused as hell. So.
Well, the reason why it's so important is because with pedophilia, you're essentially arguing that there might be, and I'm not sure because I haven't looked at your research yet, but you're essentially arguing that there might be a net increase in utility to society by allowing pedophilia. You're saying that most people that engage in pedophilic relationships are coming out ahead. But my argument would be that pedophilic actions themselves are immoral because the two people engaging that action are not weighing the risks equally. That the action itself, regardless of the outcome, would be immoral. Much the same way that I would argue that if somebody shoots a gun, so like if somebody shoots a gun at somebody because they're trying to kill them or whatever, and they accidentally shoot them in the perfect spot to like kill a tumor, somebody in your position might argue, well, that was actually an okay action because it cured the tumor. But I would argue, well, no, that was a morally wrong action because the intent was to kill the person, and we shouldn't shoot at people to do it, right? That this difference between this kind of like deontology versus utilitarian idea in how you approach the morality of actions is central to the argument. Like,
yeah, that analogy that you gave about shooting the guy and then accidentally, as I said, you talk about that isolated incident, and then it seems like there's a flaw of utilitarianism. But obviously, a utilitarian, as you said, they consider the cultural effects.
Yeah, they're not going to say all people should be shooting people.
They're not going to say, shoot a guy. You know, they're not going to say that. Okay, yeah, it's allowed to shoot a guy because there's a possibility that you could kill the tumor. So
sure,
yeah,
I'm just saying that
misleading.
Generally,
my position.
Well, yeah, I'm not trying to mislead your position. I'm just saying that in general that utilitarian philosophy suffers because if you are truly a utilitarian, if you truly believe that you can have what a deontologist would call an immoral action taking place in society, as long as there is a net gain, that kind of philosophy opens the door to a lot of actions that a lot of people would be very much against. So, for instance, compelling people to donate blood or kidneys by threat of force. You have to do this because it would undeniably be a net gain in society. If I told people that they had to donate kidneys, I would be discomforting some people to save the lives of other people. That's almost undoubtedly a gain in utility in society. Or the enslavement of groups of people if the unhappiness of those people was outweighed by the massive happiness created by other people, that somebody who is strictly utilitarian can make arguments for things in society, or even the sacrifice of a person. For instance, let's say that there are 5 people. Let's say that there are 5 Singaporean. Where are you from? You're from Singapore, right? Or am I mixing this up? Right. I don't know if you're yourself. Okay, sure. So let's say that there are 5 people from Singapore, and all of them perfectly match your background, like genetically or like blood type and all that, right? That in your universe of utilitarianism, somebody would walk up to you and say, I need to kill you because you can donate organs to save 2 or 3 or 4 people. And there's no possible way that your one life is going to outweigh the lives of 4 or 5 other people. So I'm going to kill you now. And as somebody that is a utilitarian, you would have to submit to that. You would say, well, yeah. So I guess like,
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
sure.
and you probably and you disagree with utilitarian.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I don't like. I'm not familiar with utilitarianism, but like from how you're describing it, I guess I subscribe to that. But yeah, the good thing about like moral political actions is that it's never really you have to violate somebody's human rights to get a net gain. It always seems like
but somebody like me would argue
doing good things. Doing good things. It's never that big of a con to promote good political ideas.
Well, sure, but I'm just saying that, like in this particular instance, I would argue that the act of engaging in a relationship with somebody that can't truly weigh the pros and cons, that would be an exploitation. That relationship would be exploitive. That person can't truly.
Exploitation.
Well, it is by definition. If we agree that one side can give informed consent and the other side can't, that's an exploitive relationship. You would argue that exploitive isn't necessarily right or wrong, that it would depend on the outcomes of all exploitive relationships, kind of like the example of the 100 people walking into the church. You would make the argument that, okay, sure, it might be exploitive, but exploitation isn't necessarily right or wrong. We have to look at the outcome to see if the exploitation was good or bad. Whereas I would argue, well, the act of exploiting somebody itself is wrong. I'm not concerned so much with the outcome, would be the difference in our argument. Does that make sense?
I don't like your use of the term exploitation because it brings the connotation that there is some kind of manipulation or harm involved.
So the manipulation, I wouldn't necessarily say harm, but I would say there's manipulation in that any time one side can fully weigh the pros and cons and the other side can't weigh the pros and cons, that's almost by definition exploitive.
Then after that, you give... Okay, I think it really Okay,
I'm not trying to be fair to you. I'm not trying to give I'm not trying to assign moral gravity to the word exploitive. If that makes you feel. I'm not trying to say that exploitation is wrong. Well, I personally would say it because that's my moral system. But I'm just describing the process of one person engaging in a relationship with another, where that person fully understands it and the other person doesn't. I would say that is an exploitive relationship. And then I would say that's wrong. You would say that we have to look at the outcome to see if it's right or wrong, right?
Yeah. Then you lure a kid to come over with candy, and then he comes over and then hugs you. You don't say that it's exploitative. You don't say that you're invading.
Correct, because I would argue that the 5-year-old can understand the ramifications of hugging somebody in today's society. That doesn't really carry any type of.
I would disagree with that. I would disagree because I think. I would disagree. Like,
wait,
what
why?
are you talking about? Like, he doesn't fully know what a hug entails. He doesn't really understand intimacy because he's only 4 years old. But then you'd be fine.
Well, wait, but hugs. So in today's society, or at least in Western society, I'm not aware of any major culture that carries any type of long-term stigma or ramification with a hug. I've never heard of that before.
But it's not about what society considers; it's whether or not the individual person is truly informed.
But when you say informed, we're talking about how society will respond.
Is not fully informed when he eats a pie or he gives a hug, but you don't say that he did not consent to giving that hug.
Well, but when we talk about informed, we're talking informed. Like, informed consent means being informed of society's response. It's part of the being informed, right?
Yeah, and a baby is not fully informed of how they react.
Well, a hug is pretty much an end to itself. That in Western society, hugs don't carry big stigmas. They don't, or I'm not familiar, at least in any major Western society.
But just because it doesn't carry big stigmas doesn't mean like the child is aware that whether or not it carries big stigmas. He's not informed at all of any decision really until he reaches like age 5 or something.
Well, but there's nothing to be informed of. So of course they're not informed of it. There's nothing to be informed of. He doesn't need to know anything more than just, does the hug make me feel comfortable or not? Does somebody putting their arms around me make me feel comfortable or not? Like, that's the only thing there is to be informed of. There's nothing more to be informed of.
So do you have any problems with consensual minor adult relationships? Sexual relationships?
In today's society, yes, I would say that those relationships are not morally good, that those are exploitive relationships because the younger person doesn't really have the mental faculty to make an intelligent decision, a fully informed decision about all of the consequences of their actions by engaging that, whereas the older person definitely does. So those relationships are highly exploitative.
Okay, but you said that in a utopian society, you'd be fine with that kind of sexual interaction.
I mean, kind of, yeah. But I mean, like in a utopian society, yeah. I mean, in a utopian society, I could argue that people should be able to walk around nude all the time because nobody cares about genitals or anything.
Oh, and I agree, yeah.
Sure. Yeah,
that'd be good.
But like, if we're arguing about what should be morally or ethically permissible, we have to take the world as it is, not as we'd want it to be. Now, if you want to argue that societal norms should change in regards to certain things, you can make those arguments. Like, I don't think sex should be that big of a deal, but you can't start arguing in favor of things that are a result of the changing of a societal standard that you haven't changed yet, if that makes sense.
I disagree with the, gay, and I gave the gay analogy, and you can fight for gay rights in that time, but yeah, I think we'd be going. So I guess like it would
kind of be like me arguing like let's say that I get let's say I get an assault rifle and I go around and I start shooting like white people, right? And then people are like, well, why are you doing this? And I go, well, I think I should definitely be allowed to kill white people. I definitely should be allowed to. And they're like, well, I don't understand why. And then after arguing for a while, you find out, well, the person thinks that white people, are subhuman, and in their utopia, white people don't have the right to live. Well, of course, then in that person's world, walking around killing white people is totally fine. He can do it. But first, he needs to advocate for his world where white people aren't treated as humans, right? It doesn't make sense to jump to I should be able to kill white people right now. He has to make the argument that white people aren't worthy of moral consideration first, right? Much the same way in this example, if you want to argue in favor of pedophilic relationships, you can do that. But before that, you have to go back to the societal standards of sex and say, I don't think sex should be anything more than a handshake and how we would treat it. People's genitals should be treated just like their hands or backs. There should be no difference. That you have to make that argument first, and then you can build off of that for something different.
Yeah, I'm very unsure why you gave that first analogy, because I don't think it'd be considered a utopian if you can, shoot white people.
I'm just giving an example of like where you're taking like a consequence, like a pragmatic implementation of a moral system without actually discussing the moral system first, right?
So, okay, but okay, so basically you do not have problem with adult minor consensual relationships if we lived in a utopia. So
if we lived in let me be very clear on this. If we lived in a society where there was absolutely no stigma on any type of sexual relationship whatsoever, then it wouldn't matter who engaged in any type of sexual relationship with anybody. I think most people would agree with that. You kind of have to, right? Because why would you care if anybody engaged in any relationship of any type with anybody if we lived in a utopia, right? But, say if there's like some psychological or biological evidence, I would have to look deeper into that, right? That if there's some type of intrinsic psychological harm caused, then you would make exceptions for that, of course. Sure, yeah. But I don't know that. I'm not taking your face value, but but sorry, go ahead.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then don't you think that it would be moral of us, like a good job for us to try to remove the social taboos against minor adult sexual relationships, consensual sexual
because that's a high level concept. What you would try to do is you would
then there would not be ever change.
No, it would be changed though. If you changed the concept of how people viewed sex, so like let's say that we wanted everybody to be nude, right? Instead of arguing that everybody should be allowed to be nude and walk around nude everywhere, first you would argue that people's genitals aren't really a big deal. That would be like your first argument, that it shouldn't matter if you see somebody's dick or somebody's vagina. But that's not a big deal. That's what you would focus on arguing first.
Why wouldn't you want to argue that why people should be nude?
Because if you move past that initial argument, nobody's ever going to know what it is exactly they're discussing. Because there are some people who would say that, well, genitals are intrinsically not something that everybody wants to look at. So no, of course you shouldn't be nude. That's stupid. And you would never sway that person because that would be their foundational belief. If you don't challenge that foundational belief and change it, then they're never going to agree with an upper level abstraction of that belief, right?
Okay, so how do you propose a better way to end discrimination against pedophiles, or if you want to at all?
So discrimination against pedophiles is kind of a different topic.
Or the stigma against minor adult relationships.
Well, so like, I would argue that the stigma that exists right now is well deserved because of our societal norms on sex. If you wanted to get rid of that stigma, or rather, if you wanted to say that these relationships don't deserve a stigma, what you would first have to do is get completely and totally different societal norms on sex. I'm not familiar with the example you were talking about, but earlier you mentioned like some African tribes where kids like played games with each other's dicks or something. Yeah, I think you mentioned something like that. Yeah. I'm guessing that in those tribes, everybody's probably naked a lot, and people probably engage in a lot of sex, and they probably don't have like any like huge social backlash for doing it. That like a 15-year-old doesn't tell like another 15-year-old like, oh god, you had sex, you're so gross or some shit. That to them it's probably not a big deal. That would be my guess, right?
Yeah, that's basically how it is.
Yeah, so I would argue that if that's really what you wanted, that your goal would be to your goal would be to move people over to that type of society before you start talking about like the extrapolations from those original values that you would change. The original value being whether or not we should treat sex as something that's different than any other physical contact at all, right?
Yeah, I think we have a really different way of how we want to promote change. I am thinking that the best way to promote change is to advocate for the idea that should exist in a utopian society. Because I don't know. But like for instance, let's say for the things in a utopian society, how the hell will you reach a utopian society?
Well, like let's say that you talk about gay relationships, right? Would it have ever been possible to make gay marriage happen if people thought that gays should still be murdered or that those relationships were unnatural? Like that's not how it works. You have to move in steps. First, you have to get people to understand that homosexuality is somewhat natural. Then you have to get people to understand that homosexual relationships can occur and can be perfectly fine and perfectly consensual and perfectly
it would be perfectly fine if like during the 70s, and I think that's what they did to start advocating for gay marriage. Similar to right now when I'm starting to advocate to end discrimination against pedophiles and end the social stigma against child minor relationships. So what's the problem?
Well, like all I'm saying is that I think you would have, like, let's say that both of us had a room full. Okay.
Are you thinking about what the incrementalist approach? Like
maybe
like how Obama tried to suck up the Republicans and then fail to get universal health care, that kind of thing? Or
politically, that's a much different issue. So, so let's say that we both have a room full of 100 people, okay? Let's say that these people all have traditional American values. In your room of 100 people, you can sit there and you can try and argue that I think pedophilia should be okay. And at the end of the day, you might get one person, maybe two people to come over to your camp. It would be an incredibly small number of people, right? In my room, I would argue that if my end goal was pedophilia, right? I would argue that our views on sex as a society need to change, that we shouldn't treat sexual activity as such a massive deal like we do today, that should change. That if I can get 20 or 30 people over into my camp, that the jump there from that into saying that like any type of sexual relationship should be permissible, that's not a big jump. And moving people over into past that initial hurdle of getting them into my moral system would be easier than getting people to go all the way to the most extreme thing on the other end, which would be a pedophilic relationship, right? Because now I've got like 30 people that all agree that sex isn't a big deal. Well, if you don't think sex is a big deal, then why should any sexual relationship be not okay? And then most, they could be perceptive to that. Whereas in your room, if you start right off with, 30-year-olds and 5-year-olds should be able to bang each other, well, like we're way past the point of what kind of value system these people have. And there's no possible way they would ever listen to that argument. They're just not going to hear it.
I think that's way more, actually that's way more effective because, the incrementalist approach, I think historically has really not worked. What like the saying goes, you aim for the stars and then still reach the sky. So basically you saying that I going like all the way and saying we should advocate for pedophilic relationships. Maybe like in 5 years people disagree with it. But because of the huge activism towards that, then we would reduce more taboos to sex. As opposed to you who just has the much lower goal of just ending taboos for sex, then you, I think, reach a much lower result in 5 years compared to me. And the analogy I would give is, the Obama thing where he tried to be incrementalist.
You have to be careful about the Obama thing because that's like a really complicated real world. Like politics is very complicated.
But basically, I disagree with the philosophy of incrementalism.
But like because if you want
radical ideas,
because the Obama thing actually hurts you if you really think about it. Because if say the Democrats would have pushed for single payer, we would have no change in our healthcare system. But as a result of that compromise, we got the ACA, which might be a first step towards some sort of social healthcare in the future. In your world,
I completely disagree. I think if Obama just went ahead and went full universal healthcare, and many progressives, Kaukalinsky, Young Turks, they would agree with this.
No, they wouldn't. I guarantee you,
they said that, buddy. They said that Obama was way too incrementalist in terms of promoting healthcare. If he just went ahead when he had majority in the Senate and boom, universal healthcare, we would have fucking universal healthcare.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
That's what he said, and I completely agree with it. So
I would be very interested to hear. Even Cenk wouldn't make that argument. I would be very interested to hear a clip from the Young Turks.
He always made that argument. What do you?
They might.
That's interesting. You never heard that in the Young Turks before.
They might make the argument that we should have single payer, but the idea that Obama could have pushed single payer through, I don't think so.
They definitely made that argument, especially when Obama had majority of the Senate in 2008. He just kept on prolonging it, and then he fucked up once the Republicans took over the Senate. So,
I would have to look. I mean, just on what I know of the political landscape now, I would be shocked if that was true. But I don't know. I mean,
anybody who's incrementalist, they always fail historically. So be a radical. But I guess we disagree with that too. So okay, but is there anything else in this pedophile debate we would like to talk to? Okay.
No, I think we're good. Or what's up? I would argue. Just so that you're for your just for the pedophile thing, so you're fully aware of like all the ramifications. Looking up the difference between like utilitarianism versus deontology is very interesting because it'll kind of help you illustrate more what the full ramifications of your moral system are. It's just interesting stuff to look up. Sorry, go ahead.
I didn't think that much of this discussion would be philosophy and but it's interesting. I thought it'd be mostly about child sex. But you keep on mentioning these examples of philosophy, which is it has been an interesting discussion.
Sure.
Okay. Would you perhaps would you be in favor of reducing the age of consent for sex?
So the line that we have drawn is fairly arbitrary right now, I guess. But in terms of like reducing it or lowering it, that would be something that I would kind of like defer to like expert opinion on. I'm not really sure what it actually should be. I don't think I'm qualified to give like an answer to that. Of what it should truly be. Like, I would say that like whatever the age of consent for sex is, at least with adults, it should probably be the same as the age of consent for like signing a contract or taking on any other kind of long-term legal responsibility.
Right. Yeah, and then we go back to the argument that like I think that basically like children of all ages can consent to sex and have fun with it, but yeah, I think we'd be going in.
Well, we would go back.
What about child pornography?
So that's kind of a different thing. There's like moral versus pragmatic sides of that, and I've seen a little bit of evidence on the pragmatic side, and it seems like an okay thing. I probably shouldn't say that, or it sounds bad, but like from what I've read, apparently men that are given access to child pornography have a higher chance of not actually committing pedophilic actions in real life. And I would argue that would be a moral good, that if you can prevent people from acting on those urges, that's something that should be explored for sure in a responsible environment. But I would have to make sure that data is 100% accurate. Yeah.
Right, so you're pretty open to the position of child pornography.
Well, not like the mainstream like production of and recruiting children to create it.
Oh, I mean, if it's like if it involves coercion, then no. But I'm thinking that like perfectly consensual, sex, and the child agrees to having the footage posted online. I think that would be perfect.
Yeah. So
fine.
again, your argument here is like almost tautological, and that's why we keep disagreeing. You keep saying consensual child sex, and I disagree. I think that's an oxymoron. I don't think children can consent to that. The things that I've heard discussed is I've heard that some researchers discuss the possibility of reaching out to people that are already of age. So reaching out to 20 or 30-year-old people that have had child pornography created for them, and then compensating them in some way, and then asking for use of that in treatments of pedophiles in order to keep them from offending. That's what I've read. And again, I'm not entirely sure what the conclusion is on that research, if that would prevent people from actually molesting children or not. If it would, then I would agree that that's something that should be pursued. If it wouldn't, then I would, maintain the position we have on it now. But
okay, that's interesting.
But keep in mind we're coming at this from different points of view, because my goal is to reduce the amount of pedophilia. Your goal is that pedophilia is okay. So like so I might agree with you on the action of some things, but our rationale for those actions and the outcomes that we're looking for are going to be much different. Where my outcomes are always goaled towards reducing the amount of actual child molestation, but your goal is to just normalize and make that an okay thing. These are two different things, right?
That's cool. Okay, and so that was a cool discussion. I heard you were open to the idea of incest, from what I know. So
I just think it's a different. All of these discussions are interesting to me because it's a good exploration of how we view sexuality and how we view consent and a lot of these complicated issues. So I think the discussions are always interesting, and I think that if people are revolted by a subject but they can't like actually verbalize a defense of their revulsion, then that probably means they should stop and think about it a little bit more. So if somebody says like, well, what do you think about pedophilia? And they just say, well, you're a kitty fucker. It's like, okay, well, do you actually have an argument against it or not? Or like, what do you think about incest? Oh, you want to just fuck your sister? Like, well, okay, so do you actually have so I think it's important to explore those ideas.
That's great. And like one last thing, I'm assuming that if a pedophile doesn't act on his sexual impulses, you don't think like the insane commentators on my videos on pedophilia, you don't think that they should be killed or imprisoned, right? If they don't act on their sexual urges. Even in today, so this is a totally different discussion, and I want to make sure that we have a very, very clear border separated between our previous discussion and this one. So I don't think any sort of mental illness should be demonized. The demonization of pedophiles in society is an incredibly negative thing, I would think. Even where my end goal is to reduce the amount of molested children. Pedophilia is very much a mental disorder. The more you stigmatize it, the less people seek treatment for it, and the more they're likely to act down on it by exploiting a child. So I absolutely think that pedophilia shouldn't be demonized or stigmatized, because we want to bring these people in, treat them, and then make it so they don't molest children in society. Cool. Yeah. You're still under the perception that much of the relationships are not fully consensual and they can't mutually benefit. Yeah, but we'll go into circles at this point. So cool. Yeah, that works. So I think we're good.
All right. Okay. Well, hey, thanks for the discussion, buddy. It was an interesting discussion.
That was fun.
All right.
Take care.
Yeah, have fun, buddy.
Goodbye.
Jesus fuck. What a fuck. Okay. Well, that was okay. All right. So we basically got him to be a strict utilitarian. I understand that these kinds of sexual discussions are uncomfortable for a lot of people, but hey, listen, man, embrace the discomfort. So a lot of people, because I have my experience doing these kinds of debates, a lot of people are screaming in chat that you need to like ask for the evidence and all of that. I think that this conversation is purely a philosophical one, and that asking for evidence is absolutely the wrong way to go about this type of debate. Because does the evidence of whether or not a pedophilic relationship is healthy or unhealthy, does that really influence our decision on whether or not the action itself is moral or not? And the answer to that is no, right? That even if we saw that 80% of pedophilic relationships turned out to be okay, if he had research that said that, that still doesn't mean that we're going to say, well, okay, in that case, yeah, fine. Even if children can't really understand the ramifications of their actions, we'll let them do it because most of them turn out okay. We wouldn't say yes there at all. So people that are pushing for evidence, go to the research. Like, that's not at all how I would approach that conversation whatsoever. I don't want to get lost in the weeds of debating like obscure social or psych studies about the health or the health benefits or takeaways of people engaged, because that's like getting lost in the weeds of something that is totally not relevant to the discussion of should somebody who can't truly give informed consent to a sexual activity be allowed to engage in it. That's a totally different thing. Destiny, but he's using evidence to dismiss one of your moral arguments, and the conversation stops there. No. I think that we brought the conversation about as fundamental as it could be, and I'm content with where we brought it. So if he is a strict utilitarian, I can ignore most of his moral positions because I'm not a strict utilitarian. And most people wouldn't be a strict utilitarian, right? So the idea is, once we've established that he's after whatever increases the maximum utility in society, then we can start asking him, we can pose hypotheticals that most people would consider morally abhorrent. So, for instance, that's why we pose the slavery question. If 500,000 people were enslaved, but it made most people happy, would you be okay with that? Well, a utilitarian would say, yes, of course, slavery is okay. If somebody were to morally compel you to donate a kidney, would you be okay with that? Well, sure. If it would make another person survive, then okay, right? Most people in society are not comfortable with the extrapolations that you get from a utilitarian point of view. So, that's why. So bringing him back into that and then getting him to admit yes to those answers, which is okay for him. He was consistent in his utilitarian ideology, but most of us, I think, are not utilitarians, if that makes sense, right? He's not a strict utilitarian. You posed a kidney question, but he dodged it completely. No, I don't think he did. He got hung up on something else, but I'm pretty sure he would say yes in that you should morally compel people in society. Somebody's been linking a picture in chat. I'll link it. I can't really show it on stream. Just because my thing is on, but this picture kind of summarizes his position, right here. Why did you try to argue by using current social norms? You rejected that argument against incest, but used it here. Well, because the arguments are fundamentally different. I could get deeper into that, but I really don't want to. so never mind. We're not going into that. Actually, hold on. I guess we can do this on stream. Oh, here's the, this would be the utilitarian meme. And actually, you didn't even have to modify this picture. Initially, this first thing is, somebody stole my bike when I was 9 years old. I was pretty bummed out about it. I don't have a bike or some shit, but I think whoever stole it was probably more happy to drive my bike than I am sad to have my bike stolen. The total happiness in the world increased, so whatever, right? This would be like a utilitarian view of society. But nobody actually views, or most people don't view society this way, like in a strict utilitarian sense, if that makes sense. How would you describe your moral system as far as on an academic level? I wouldn't at all. I don't have the necessary background, and whatever I would describe it as, most people would get upset because I would be incorrect. That's why half of this debate I was saying utilitarianist instead of utilitarian. Yeah. That's a crude form of utilitarianism. Well, I think that any strict form of ethics or any strict things are going to have problems with them. That's how people attack them, right? People attack utilitarians by saying, well, if you truly believe that increasing utility to society is the best thing, here's a whole bunch of morally horrible actions that will increase the happiness of everybody. Should we do it, right? That would be a challenge to utilitarians. Now, and I think the opposite would be a deontologist who would say, well, every action should be judged by its moral right or wrongness, right? And then I think what is the popular challenge to that is like a Nazi knocks on your door and asks you, are there people downstairs? And well, lying is a moral wrong. Well, if you say yes, then Jews are going to be killed in your basement and the Nazis are going to come in and do it. So you would lie to the person that, well, if you lied to them, then you're arguing that the utility that gained from saving those poor people was greater than the deontological than the idea that an action itself is morally right or wrong, right? That you would look at the outcome there, right? There's always I'm sorry. Holy fuck. If any of these topics interest you, I highly recommend. There are so many good philosophy channels on YouTube and on Reddit where you can read a ton of things about philosophy. If this is interesting, you go there. Don't get all of your philosophy information from me because I'm probably butchering the fuck out of most of these explanations, okay? But all I'm saying is that anytime you go strict down one road or the other, you can get lost in some pretty fucked moral positions where everything becomes very lost. You kind of have to balance out between the two. And all I was trying to illustrate with Amos's position, Amos, all I was trying to illustrate with him is that if he wanted to be a strict utilitarian, then that means that he has to accept, which is what he was, because he was saying that, well, if most pedophilic relationships turn out okay, then they should be fine. That is an argument you can make. That's the same as the argument of 100 people walk into a room, 98 walk out millionaires, 2 of them are forced to lose arms. You can argue that that's a morally permissible situation because most of them, came out way better than the other people, but most people in society, just intuitively, which is a bad way to get ethics, but intuitively, most people in society would say, well, no, I don't want to be forced to have to make a decision like that, or not even make a decision, be forced into something like that where I didn't consent to putting my arm up to gamble for $1 million. That's bullshit, Would you pull the lever on the trolley problem? I wouldn't. I would let the 4 people be killed, and then the 1 person wouldn't be killed. I wouldn't pull the lever, I don't think. But I'm not a strict deontologist, and I think I said I was before, and then somebody emailed me and got really mad at me for saying it. So I try not to say that. I don't think anybody is a strict one or the other. You always have a balance, I think. There's a good example of this in a short story. I read it in regards Omelas, and they talk about utilitarianism. Can you talk about that? I've never heard of that story before, sorry. Immanuel Kant, The Categorical Imperative, a good counter-philosophy. Check it out. Okay, I'll go ahead and read on that. You Adam beat when he conceded the STDs. You should have focused on showing him how that contradicts his stance. Oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, the STD part, he was really rough in too, sure. But I think he would just argue that most people don't have STDs, because then he started talking about minimizing risk, in which I said that it's not about the risk, it's about the action itself, right? Oh, that's a counter to utilitarianism as well, right? Is shouldn't you donate all of your money? There's a tongue-in-cheek counter to that. I don't remember what it was. It was something some people just need a cup of coffee or something. There's, I don't remember it, dude. You should really take a philosophy class. Everybody should take a philosophy class, okay? I think he argued the STD point poorly. He could have done it better. That's actually true, Brett. He actually could have argued the STD point much better, and he could have argued the cigarette one better too. I realized it as I was posing the question, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to help him out. What he should have said for the STD point was, well, Destiny, I'm arguing that pedophilic relationships that aren't physically unhealthy should be okay. Well, in an STD-related case, this is where it actually poses a real health risk to the child. So that wouldn't be something I would be talking about. Destiny. He probably should have said that, and then we would have had to go back and forth on that a little bit. I thought of that, and I was hoping he wouldn't say it, and he didn't say it, so we dodged a bullet there. I can't believe you brought up the legal child porn meme. I was the guy who sent you that email. Oh, were you? Somebody sent me an email once, and it was really interesting. It might have been you that sent that email. But basically, I'd never read about it before, but basically, so let me expand on this a little bit. Some researcher, I think, was putting forth, basically the claim was that people that had access to child pornography were less likely to actually offend in real life. That was the argument. And the researcher posed the question that maybe we could approach people who are adults now, ask them if we could use child pornography that was made of them and either leaked on the internet or whatever, right? Pay them some amount of money for it and then distribute those materials to people that are currently seeking clinical help. And that it would be a way to prevent it. So it would be like a threefold thing. One, you would prevent those people from offending by giving them access to legal child pornography. Two, you would stop more child pornography from being made because you're procuring child porn that's already been made. And then three, you would be finding a way to compensate the victims of said child pornography by paying them some amount of money based on the treatment or whatever, right? It was I've never read anything like that before, but yeah, I remember you might have been the one that sent me that email that was posing that thing. And I mean, like, assuming that all the premises are true, I mean, I don't necessarily see a problem with that, sure. But I don't know if that's true or not. If people with access to child pornography are less likely to offend, I don't know if the answer to that is settled. I'm not sure. I would have to look into that more. Even without social stigma, wouldn't the STD thing still be a problem? Why did you concede to pedophilia being okay in a utopian society if there's still a risk that the child is informed of? I don't know if it would be. That's why I said I would still have to argue, but I'm just arguing that if you wanted pedophilia to be accepted, the sex standards in society would have to be completely and radically changed from what they are today. They would have to be totally different than what they are. But even if the sex standards were totally different, you might still make arguments against pedophilic relationships being okay because of the informed consent thing, right? And the STD thing, that was actually something I just thought up. I didn't think it up. Cobain or somebody in chat mentioned it. I didn't actually think of this before. But the STD thing is a very real thing where you've got to weigh the consequences of a sexual action. And even in a society where sexual actions where sexual action wasn't treated as a big deal, a child still wouldn't have the ability to understand whether or not they were risking the acquisition of an STD. Acquisition of STD, is that like a way to say that? So the child still wouldn't really be able to truly consent to that sexual relationship, right? You should look up Nozik's Utility Monster. It's a simple thought experiment that sounds like what you were getting at with donating all your money or whatever. It's extremely difficult to challenge. Oh, were you the one that brought up the Utility Monster meme before? I don't know what that means. I'd never heard of that before. Utility Monster is a thought experiment in the study of ethics created by philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974 as a criticism of utilitarianism. Okay, let's read this. I'm curious. It's always good to know these. Once he admitted to being a utilitarian, I was so happy because it made the rest of the argument so much easier at that point. Ugh. Whew. Okay. Thank you, JF, for our philosophy background, for our very, 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 very brief philosophy background. Again, I implore you, if any of these topics interest you, I highly, highly, highly implore you to look these up on YouTube or Reddit or take a class in your college or whatever. Philosophy is very, very interesting. I think it should be a required class for everybody. Just the idea behind like critical thinking and everything is so, so, so important. I wish I'd taken a philosophy class in school now. But okay. And also I say that because if these topics interest you, please don't just report shit. Don't report shit that I say or repeat shit that I say to your friends and shit, because I could be like totally fucking wrong, okay? I could be misrepresenting something or missing a very important nuanced point. All of my information comes from reading Wikipedia articles and talking to people. I don't have like a professor that's, illustrated these topics to me and let me ask questions. So I could be misrepresenting things as well, okay? Okay, so let's read this. A hypothetical being, which Nozick calls the utility monster, receives much more utility from each unit of a resource they consume than anyone else does. For instance, eating a cookie might bring only 1 unit of pleasure to an ordinary person, but could bring 100 units of pleasure to a utility monster. If the utility monster can get so much pleasure from each unit of resource, it follows from utilitarianism that the distribution of resources should acknowledge this. If the utility monster existed, it would justify the mistreatment and perhaps annihilation of everyone else. According to the mandates of utilitarianism, because for the utility monster, the pleasure they receive outweighs the suffering they may cause. Nozick writes, utilitarian theory is embarrassed by the possibility of utility monsters who get enormously greater sums of utility from any sacrifice of others than these others lose. The theory seems to require that we all be sacrificed in the monster's maw in order to increase the total utility. The thought experiment attempts to show that utilitarianism is not actually egalitarian, even though it appears to be at first glance. Interesting. So, like, You always say, I just read Wikipedia, I've never taken a class, but when I debate people online and give I took a class as a source, they laugh. Oh, well, take a class and say you read Wikipedia, and now you've got the best of both worlds. This is actually very interesting. So like, this is another you could think of like a million. I think utilitarianism is really dumb. Okay, it's just dumb, bro. It's dumb. But I don't know much about it, right? So I could be an idiot, right? It's not really. I really don't have the authority to say that. But I feel like I could think of a million challenges to utilitarian theory, right? So like, if we talk about the utility monster, right? Let's say that we have a giant pyramid that's built in the middle of our society, and every year we capture 10 people, and then we torture them and murder them on top of this to sacrifice them so that everybody can watch it and rejoice, right? In this society, you would say that a utilitarian would say, well, sure, this is fine. You capture 10 random people, you put them on top of the pyramid, you sacrifice them. The net gain and happiness for that society absolutely outweighs the suffering of those 10 people. It's a totally morally justifiable under a utilitarian system. That would be like another way of kind of illustrating this point. Or like, there's like a million different ways to illustrate this point, you know? Oh, I've had my shit muted. I'm sorry. Have I been missing like people donating or asking questions? Jewish Mobster Prime donation or Prime sub for 14 months. Thanks. $100 bits from White Knight 696969. Okay, nothing too interesting. Okay. You don't think that ethical frameworks are an inherent mechanism, do you? That they're just contextual lenses to view individual situations? Nobody goes through life as a Kantian or utilitarian? I'm not sure. I would have to think about that more. I don't know. Destiny, that challenge you just gave was just a utility monster reworded. Well, everything is a utility monster, right? When we're talking about the happiness of some or for the sadness of the others, kind of, right?
Wowie.
Wowie. Mill's utilitarianism addresses that with higher and lower order pleasures, to be fair. Oh, so what? He would say like a higher order pleasure, it would kind of be like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he would say that like you can't sacrifice somebody's like access to food to increase your like pleasurable enjoyment of recreational activity or something, kind of like that. I don't mean to bring up like hierarchy of needs things, but like, you know what I mean? That like you can't kill somebody to make somebody else happy, that the difference in needs there, the difference in utility these are on different levels that aren't like exchangeable or something. Yeah. Why does the framework of utilitarianism need to be based on happiness? So utilitarianism is generally concerned. Oh my fucking god, I hate giving these definitions, okay? You shouldn't be listening to a fucking video game streamer about these things, okay? That's my disclaimer. I believe that utilitarianism just means increasing the utility in society, and people typically see happiness as a large utility. That happiness is something that's good and desirable. Most people want to be happy, so you would view that as something that you would want to increase. So that's like an increase in utility by increasing happiness.
Destiny
Does that
on
make
Instagram.
sense? Wow, thanks, MacMoom. I think you have a discussion with a philosophy PhD on utilitarianism and flesh out some of your thoughts. It's very common for laymen to be drawn to deontologist arguments and be repulsed by utilitarian ones, but within professional philosophy, the adherents are typically split very evenly. I don't think that any philosopher, though, is 100% on either side, right?
TFW, the utility monster takes all your hot chocolates to fellas.
Utility is just a naturalistic definition for the good. Yeah, like things that are good.
Do you have any philosophy channels you regular or are good?
No. I'm sorry, I don't. I should watch some. I just like to sit here and spew my pseudoscience, okay? You can't really partially subscribe to deontology, especially Kantianism. That's kind of the point. But can't you? Like, so for instance, I would argue that, what would I argue? You can't really partially subscribe to deontology. No, maybe you're right, because a deontologist says that every action is judged by its moral, by whether or not it's morally right or wrong, regardless of outcome, right? So, like, how would a deontologist ever be okay with taxation? Right? Could a deontologist ever be okay with taxes? But what if the person willingly gives up their taxes, but taxes are compelled upon you from the state? I don't know. I would have to think. I don't know. I'm not sure. I would have to go into that. Aren't you as a streamer utility monster for your supporters? Correct. Giving me money makes all of you more happy, so all of you should give me all of your money to increase I am the utility monster. The idea that you're thinking of is a categorical imperative. Okay, I don't actually know what that means. Categorical imperative is the central philosophical concept of the deontological moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant.
Don't you think if the goal was just to win the debate, you should have been harsher on his crazier statements like the 4-year-olds contenting? It does seem you went a little soft.
No, I'm not really concerned at, like, screaming at somebody. So, like, this is, like, a really big distinction that I make in my debates, and it might be something that I change in the future, because I'm kind of losing hope, because some of the people that I talk to are really stupid, where my goal is to always have fact-based discussion, and my goal is to always approach what is true at the end of my discussions. Like, I want to be closer to truth at the end of every discussion or every amount of research I do. I want to get closer and closer to what is true. When I argue with people, I want people to view it similar to me, and that they're ultimately concerned with truth, so I only appeal using fact or data. Is what I try to do. I try to make those types of appeals. This means that I intentionally try to stay away from emotional appeals or anecdotal appeals or any other type of appeal that isn't rooted in, like, hard reason and logic. Or like fact-based appeals. I try to stay away from those. So, like, when you say that, like, shouldn't you be crazier at statements like 4-year-olds, like, there are people that do that already. If you want to watch, like, you can go watch the whole Skeptosphere, like, oh, you want to be a kitty fucker, you want to, like, you can do that if you want. If those are, like, the kind of appeals that you want to make, those aren't really interesting to me. Like, anybody can sit here and kind of argue from like an appeal to tradition kind of thing. Like, well, that's fucking wrong because it's fucking disgusting, you kitty fucker. Like, if you want to do that, that's cool, and there are places to do that. But I don't know. I'm just not interested in those types of arguments. I'm more interested in, like, well, why is this wrong? You know, why should this, like, give me a rational reason to be against this instead of just being, you know, morally incredulous. We want real fucking philosophy memes. Can you please define for the stream what exactly you mean when you use the word truth? I don't actually fucking know. Ooh, that's a hard one. The problem is that by not going harder, you shit up your Twitter stream with people calling you a pedophile apologist. Yeah, but I mean, like, I can always bring those people on and make them look dumb. I mean, I'm okay with that too, right? Do you think that, like the one guy that I brought on last time, I would hope that most people saw him as looking pretty stupid. The guy that wanted to argue, I don't even remember what the fuck, the Sinatra guy. And we did that without any type of appeals to emotion or anything. But I don't know if that should be my goal, is to make the other person look stupid, or if my goal should be to genuinely convert the other person. Something that I was seriously considering, because I was talking about this with somebody last night a lot, and it made me think, I'm staying awake too late. I've been staying awake way too late these last few nights. But something that I was kind of thinking was that maybe I should try a debate. Maybe I should try a debate where my goal is to convince the other person. And I'm not sure how I would feel about that. So, like, do you remember my conversation with Carrie? Where, like, because, like, for that guy that I brought on last night or yesterday, what if I brought the guy on and I was like, and he was like, well, listen, you know, people don't make these decisions, blah, blah, blah. You can't just group everybody together, blah, blah, blah. What if I would have started in and I would have been like, okay, listen, dude, all right? I didn't want to get, like, too bogged down in the stats, okay? But I had 10 friends growing up who were all black. I was raised in a neighborhood where we had all black friends, and I knew all 10 of these dudes, and 9 of them went to bed hungry every single night. And these guys didn't have money for good books for school. These guys didn't have anything, and I knew a lot of them. You know, a couple of them were really fucking smart dudes. Like, I remember growing up when we were in 3rd grade together in the public school, they would help me with my homework. Like, that's how smart these two guys were, and I consider myself to be pretty good at, like, math and shit. And when we got older and we went to different high schools, and I saw how fucked they were in life because they had no access to any of this shit, I don't know, it just made me really sad, and it kind of made me think, like, damn, like, if they would have went to the same high school I did, maybe they could have grown up as smart as me. Like, I still know these guys. Like, 2 of them are fucking locked up. I'm pretty sure a couple of them are dead, you know, and, like, the other 3 or 4 of them are just, like, gangbanging, you know? It's really sad. Like, if I were to approach the issues with things like that, I feel like, and it hurts It hurts me. But I feel like at the end of a story like that, the guy would say something like, yeah, I can definitely see that, you know, like, yeah, that's definitely a big problem. We should definitely, because how is he going to sit there and discredit my anecdote, right? Because that's all they do all day is they just give these stupid fucking bullshit stories, right? It's like, what the fuck am I supposed to say to that? Like, like, remember the Carrie girl? We did that with her. Where I was trying to have a discussion on women's agency, and then halfway through this argument, I started to just make up fucking stories because I realized that like nothing I was gonna say to her was getting through, and she kept making up stories. I was like, okay, you know what, dude, what were some of the stories we made up? She actually started to believe me. Hold on. They would come, you know, we would be playing games in high school and whatnot. Sometimes they would drop by. Hold on.
You're going through like an obstacle course. You're hopping up and down. You're going through rapids and stuff like that, and they loved that.
Yeah.
So
I guess like if I look at like my own life when I was growing up, I remember that I had a lot of guy friends and a lot of girlfriends growing up, or friends that were girls in high school and whatnot, right? And I knew like a lot of these girls personally, like they would come, you know, we would be playing games in high school and whatnot, and sometimes they would drop by, and that every time, you know, we would talk to them like, hey, like why don't you play games or whatever, a lot of these girls would literally say things like, my dad didn't buy me a console because he thought that games were for boys. This is all bullshit. I'm making all of this up, okay? This is all fucking bullshit, okay? I went to an all-boys high school, all right? It's like, so we didn't play this kind of stuff growing up, right? Like I heard that kind of talk a lot from girls. Don't you think that these would be people that probably as they get older, not only would they not play games, but then maybe they wouldn't buy games for their kids because they kind of grew up thinking that, you know, women are...
I think that they would probably buy games for their kids. I mean, because that's just the cultural norm at this point. Is like video gaming. Well, yeah. I mean, even my parents know about it. But I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. And sure, there are those people out there that...
This is like, so we just went through an hour of talking and she wouldn't budge on anything. But as soon as I started to make these stories up, she was like, well, yeah, oh yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying. Oh, I totally get it. As soon as I started, and I just started like making up like a million fucking stories.
Hold those kinds of those sexist outlook on boys and girls, but you're usually going to find those in like the really conservative, like close-knit type areas.
Sure, but it used to be way more common across most of the U.S. than it is today, right? Like
those types of views?
Yeah, like
boys versus girls?
Yeah, that people wouldn't buy girls consoles. Like, I know growing up,
I make up like 10 different stories here. Hold on, let me see if I can find out.
To play the consoles, and the parents didn't even like that, but their parents just wouldn't buy them gaming systems because they didn't think that was
I wonder why. Well, maybe it was because of the games that were available. They weren't like girly stuff, and maybe the parents didn't think that it was appropriate for their kids to be playing like Mortal Kombat.
But that's
I know my parents didn't have a problem with me doing it.
Why does Mortal Kombat have to be a girly game? Or why can't that be a girl and boy game? Why does it have to be for only boys?
There's girl characters in Mortal Kombat. Yeah, it's just more violent. It's just bloody. Girls don't like bloody. We just don't like violence.
You guys deal with blood more than men do.
But that's not violent, and it's not blood.
I mean, some don't like violent.
Don't like it.
When women give birth, women have to deal with more blood loss and trauma in their average life than a guy. You've had 3 children, right?
I did not look at it once. I did not look once when I was giving birth. I gave birth naturally all 3 times. I didn't want to see that shit. That's gruesome.
Yeah, but so you've dealt with even more than no epidural or anything?
Oh, hell yeah, I had drugs. Are you kidding me?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No, I'm talking about I didn't have a C-section.
Oh,
that's like the norm now. No, they were born vaginally. But no, I didn't look. I didn't want to see that.
Sure, but I mean, you still went through it. So
you can't tell me that you put.
Let's find more. Hold on.
But I'm saying
that, farmers who know your game.
But I'm just saying that if you put these girls in a room with 2 guys that maybe grew up in like San Francisco. I'm in Nebraska, so maybe we're a little.
No wonder you don't have anything to do. No wonder y'all are watching crazy shit on the internet. No wonder your game. You were bored.
But I'm saying
farmers who know your game.
But I'm just saying that if you put these girls in a room with 2 guys that maybe grew up in like.
Yeah, I mean, of course. Yeah, I mean, if you have more figures in society representing.
Well, if I'm making this face, we probably told a story. All right, hold on. Let me see.
Right? Like,
well, that's fantastic.
So like.
Sorry, fuck. I talk way too fast. Hold on.
Had this movie not existed because advertisers say that only men like to do these kinds of things, she might have never gone into it, right? So what I'm saying is that if you have these people in society like showing. I knew a girl that oh my god, I think she actually competed. I don't think it was in the Olympics, but in an Olympic qualifier. This girl, the only reason that she went into the Olympics or was doing Olympic level athleticism, I don't remember if she was a swimmer or what, but she did it because she watched Kill Bill because she thought that the Kill Bill movies were so cool, and that was like one of the things that at an early age inspired her to like take it really, really seriously, right? Like,
well, that's fantastic.
So like, had this movie not existed because advertisers say that only men like to do these kinds of things, she might have never gone into it, right? So what I'm saying is that if you have these people in society like showing that hey, women can kick ass, women can be violent or do whatever that men can do, that more women would be more likely to think that way.
Yeah. I mean, of course. Yeah. I mean, if you have more figures in society representing certain ideals or certain traits, then yeah.
This is my whole argument. This is my whole argument for an hour. I couldn't get her to budge on any of this. There is an hour where she absolutely won't listen to a single thing. So like. I'm not trying to make fun of somebody here, but like this represents a very important. There's like 2 very different roads you can go down. Rhetorically, right? What should my goal be at the end of a discussion with somebody? Hold on. Almost been a year of me telling you I hate your stream monthly. Thanks for the hug at TwitchCon, but this stream is still shit. Wow, thanks, Boggy. Somebody donated $3, and I don't even know if it shows up on stream. Here is all my money. Bonus meme. You really shouldn't help people with their arguments for pedophilia like you did. Am I right? Listen, dude, I think everybody should make better arguments. Okay, yeah, anyway. But, like, This is a really good question, you know, like, what's better? Should you appeal to somebody using fact and data and reason because you think that those are the things that should be the most important things that people value? Or should your goal just be to bring people over to your side regardless of the rhetorical technique you use, you know? And that's like, I don't know what the correct answer is to that. That's something that I've wrestled with personally in my life. Because again, like I very, very stringently try to only stick to like reason or data or fact, right? These are the arguments that I try to make. And that's what I advocate for people to do. But it's a much less effective technique than other techniques. Like appeals to emotion are very, very, very effective, you know? So yeah, I'm not sure. Ethos, logos, and pathos. Yeah, I think it's logos, right? Why do you think everyone should make better arguments? Because I think that truth is something that should be valued, and I think that everybody should value truth. I think it should be valuable to every single person. I understand right now, and I always thought that growing up that was a given, that everybody valued being correct or knowing what is true. But I think that a lot of people value what feels good and what makes you feel good, or comfort, rather. Oh my God, is this the Athene argument? Did I just click? That most people's core value is comfort, and instead they will reject truth in an attempt to be comfortable rather than seeking an uncomfortable truth. Oh, fuck. I think we just clicked, boys. Oh, shit. Delete the fucking VOD. Leave the pedophilia shit up. You can call me a fucking pedophile, but don't call me a goddamn clicker. Don't call me a goddamn clicker. But, no, but this is something that I believed. And I think I said as much to Athene, that I told Athene that I do agree with him on a philosophical level to some extent about a lot of what he said. But that I think that a lot, and I noticed this a lot on the types of insults that people use against me, on the types of insults that you people use against me sometimes. Was it the Control-Alt-Og guy? I temp banned him from my subreddit for this because I got so ass-pained when I read it. But like, I see insults used like this, even in my own subreddit. I see insults used like this in me a lot. He does this a lot. He cares too much about moral consistency. And I notice a lot during the vegan debates where it's like, God, this guy is so stupid. Like, he tries everything he can just to be consistent. And it's like, well, yeah, because that's like the most important thing to me, is being consistent. Of course. Yeah, absolutely, you know? Yeah, and I find it interesting when people use this as like an insult sometimes, when I would consider it a compliment. So yeah, I'm not sure how many people value what is true versus what feels good or what feels comfortable, you know? You could lose the truth if you pursue only effectiveness, and people will see your appeals and tricks as a proof that you don't have truth, just like you hate when alt-writers use effective but flawed tactics. Yeah, maybe, yeah. Is your argument that against pedophilia that kids can't give consent? If your argument for needing minors consent to sex because they don't know the ramifications, do you think we should think the same way with heavy sugar diet / drinking lots of soda, or just bad eating habits in general, since a kid has no idea how to be bad? Oh, yeah, of course. If you're checking for consistency there, I will be more consistent than most people. I think that if you have a child who is obese, maybe even overweight, I think that should be considered child abuse. Absolutely. Like in every legal, in every sense of the word, in every legal sense, in every moral sense, that if you have a child that is under the age of 18, or especially under the age of 12 or 13, and that child is obese, that should be considered child abuse, for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Could overworking your child and hurting them to have them lose weight be considered abuse too then? Well, yeah, anytime you hurt your child is kind of abusive, right? Sure. That reminds me of the our relationships you talked about with the overweight chick and the wife child abuse because she made her run. Oh, that was the saddest post I'd ever read. Somebody made a post on, this was like one of the healthiest parenting posts that I'd ever read in my entire life. A woman made a post on our relationships. I don't know if the post is still up or not, but she had a problem because her daughter was overweight. And this mom was taking the most active approach ever to helping this child lose weight. She ran with her child. I think she played DDR with her child. She was like actively encouraging her. She was there the entire step of the way. And I think you could argue that maybe this is a little fucked up if you're a pussy. I don't think it is. She bought her child clothes that were a little bit too small for her with the hope that like, hey, like if we keep doing this and working out, then in a few months, you know, you'll be able to fit into these clothes. It'll be awesome. And the mom was super active. She would eat with the daughter. She would run with the daughter. She would do everything to help her daughter lose weight. And oh my God, dude, our relationships fucking annihilated this woman. Oh my God. You're abusing your child. You're going to cause long-term health impacts. You're going to make her hate herself. She's going to be bulimic. She's going to be blah, blah, blah. It was, oh my God. Our relationship shat on her. It wasn't even close. The people in this thread were fucking crazy fucking hating on this woman. And it was like, it was really sad. Yeah, and I thought the mom was doing like really, really active, like a really good job at like trying everything to keep her child active and encouraged and working alongside her. Like,